Now, when I say the word Olympics, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Is it the 5 rings, the torch? Maybe it's Usain Bolt making another group of the fastest runners in the world look slow. But I'll tell you what you probably don't think about. The fact that no Olympics in the history of the Games has ever stayed on budget. Think about that for a second. No Olympic Games in the hundreds of years that the Olympics have been around have ever been able to stay on budget. Now, what we're going to do is take a look at why that is. And I'm going to help you do that by running you through some of the Olympics' major events. And at the end, I'd like you to really take a look at these games and hold them accountable for the things that they forced these governments to do. After all, the Olympics are world-renowned, famous for their ability to concentrate all the best athletic talent around the world in one place. But are they really worth it for the host country? Do the pros outweigh the cons? And, most importantly, are the Olympics sustainable? Let's start off with answering that question first. Are the Olympics sustainable? Now, when I say sustainable, I don't mean it in the environmental sense, though that is a large part of it. I'm talking about whether these games will be more beneficial than detrimental for the host country 10, 20, even 30 years into the future. That being said, I don't think any other country has done this better than Australia in the 2000 Sydney Winter Olympics. They were dubbed the Games of Environmental Responsibility, and certainly not without reason. Over the course of the Games, 300 million hectares of waterways and industrial wasteland were cleaned out. Now, I get that might be a little bit difficult to picture, so let me put it for you another way. Over the course of these Games, 750 football fields worth of land were reclaimed. That's a massive amount of land. And it only happened because the Australian government insisted on putting their Olympic parks right in the center of a liquid waste deposit. And what that did is force the government to go through with the cleaning project they had started in that area years prior, and finish it to the very end, which I'm sure most of you are aware by now, governments don't tend to do otherwise. Even just ignoring that, every aspect of these games was built using environmentally sustainable materials. And now, 14 million people come to the Sydney Olympic Parks to visit every single year, meaning all the work that they put into these games came back to benefit them years in the future. Imagine all the money that tourism must be bringing in. Compare that to cities like Berlin, whose own Olympic stadiums lay abandoned in ruins, inadvertently putting millions of dollars of taxpayer money to waste. Now, the environmental benefits of the Olympics are nothing compared to the social benefits that these games might mean for hosting countries. Let's take a look at the 2016 Rio Olympics as an example of this. Set during an economic recession, where hundreds of families were living paycheck to paycheck, leaving millions in debt, and 28% of the population reporting being in a state of extreme poverty. Then came the Olympics, a massive event where millions of people were going to come flooding into Rio. And as soon as that got announced, the government started scrambling around to make sure the country was ready when that happened. Now, because of that panic, the government itself didn't actually make a profit. But independent companies inside the country did make money from the increase in tourism. Money which they could then put into implementing a security system to protect them from the rampant crime rate in Rio. The federal government even contributed $186 million to help with implementing that security system. And if you combine this with the fact that the government was busy implementing a new state-of-the-art transportation system to make sure that when the tourists arrived in the city, they were able to go where they needed to go, and you end up with a country that's both safer and more industrialized than it ever could have been without the Olympics intervention. And all of that sounds great. And some of it is. Some of it. Because while the government was benefiting off the massive tourist boom brought on by these games, behind the scenes, eviction order after eviction order was being sent out to the citizens of so-called underdeveloped communities. This was so that when the tourists came into Rio and they made their commute from the poorer north to the richer south, where the Olympics were being held, they would never have to come to terms with what Rio as a city really was, and what the government was scrambling around desperately trying to cover up. This truth they were so afraid of were called favelas. underdeveloped, struggling communities living on the outskirts of Rio. Now, one of the more well-known of these favelas is known as Vila Autódromo, a colorful community with one of the lower crime rates out of all of them, and where its citizens lived in relative peace. That was, of course, until the bulldozers came. Buildings were torn down to make room for infrastructure, and citizens were given a choice: either stay and fight, or take the money and leave to public housing complexes, far away from the Olympics and their home. These are real people with a family and a culture and relationships being stripped away from everything that they've ever known by a government who's taking every measure to ensure that no record is left of their existence. As you can probably expect, more than a few stayed. More than a few were injured. And what's even worse is that Vila Autódromo was unique in that its citizens were even given a choice. Most communities that received eviction orders then don't exist anymore. Around the city, 6,000 people were either evicted or threatened by it, and the compensation was limited, if there at all. Now, the international community hadn't gained wind of this atrocity until it was far too late to do anything, partially because of the Rio government's implementation of a propaganda drive, which covered up all of the atrocities that they had committed using the buzz surrounding the Olympics. This act of using the Olympics as a way to cover up questionable practices by these countries' governments is a long-running tradition. And to look at one of the worst offenders of this, let's take a look at the 2008 Beijing Olympics. China at the time was being accused of multiple human rights violations regarding the Muslim concentration camps taking place within their borders. Millions were dying. Millions were suffering. But what's worse is it wasn't good for tourism. The Chinese government was able to use the buzz surrounding the Olympics to cover these atrocities, and they got away with it. The act of using the buzz surrounding the Olympics to cover up state-sanctioned atrocities is called sports washing, and it's been a part of the Olympics since the very beginning. Now, to wrap everything up in a governmentally institutionalized bow, I'd like to talk to you about the first issue that I addressed within this speech, which is that no Olympic Games have ever been completed within budget. And to really give you a sense of the extent of this issue, I'd like to walk you through one of the worst instances of this issue. Montreal, who ended the 1976 Olympic Games 5 times over budget. 5 times. Just for some context, the set budget was $300 million. For anyone unable to do the math in their head, the 1976 Olympic Games ended up costing the Montreal government $1.5 billion. Montreal itself ended up with a deficit of $1.6 billion, which took 30 years to pay off, all for an event lasting 16 days. Montreal served as a wake-up call to any country hoping to bid for the next year's Olympics, and to this day serves as one of the biggest failure stories in Olympic history. So to conclude, the Olympics are dying. They have been for a while now. The trend every year seems to be fewer and fewer countries bidding to host the next year's Olympics, a trend that doesn't seem subject to change, especially with the Olympics' tendency of luring these countries in with deals where tourism goes in and money comes out. Deals which never exactly seem to come to fruition. We are threatening to let the Olympic legacy fade away if we don't start implementing change. And I do mean real fundamental change. Let's start with sticking to the budget, for instance, to avoid another Montreal. Making an example of cities like Sydney and using the Olympics as an excuse to change things for the better. And of course, holding governments accountable for the atrocity that they commit under the Olympic name to avoid another Rio. Because if we don't do that, then we threaten to allow the hundreds of years the Olympics have been around and the legacy that they've put into the world to die off. And I guess it's up to us to figure out how we feel about that happening. Thank you.